gel, but the most common one is from silica, and that's what I have here. By volume though, it's actually less than 1% silica, and over 99% of it is just air. This makes it extremely light, and when I'm holding it, I can almost barely tell that it's there. There are many potential uses for silica aerogel, but its simplest and probably most common use is as a thermal insulator. This is because it's mostly made of air, which in general is a good insulator, but the key part is that all this air is trapped in a network of silica. This makes it really hard for the air molecules to move around and for the heat to transfer to the other side. After watching a few videos about it, mostly by Veritasium, I decided that I had to try making it myself. On the surface, the general process was relatively simple, where all I had to do was make an alcohol-based gel and then dry it. However, the issue is that in practice, it's way more difficult, and getting even a decent quality aerogel is really hard. I'd never done anything like this before, but I had faith that I could do it. To start my mission, the first thing that I had to do was make the alcohol-based gel, which I thought was going to be relatively easy. However, that really didn't turn out to be the case. The first problem was that there wasn't just a perfect recipe for the gel, and everyone seemed to have their own slightly different way of making it. I wasn't looking for anything fancy though, and I wanted it to be as easy as possible, and it seemed like a recipe from aerogel.org fit that perfectly. The first chemical that I needed for it was the hardest to get, and it was something called tetramethyl orthosilicate, or TMOS for short. This is basically a liquid source of silica, and because of that, it's also really dangerous. My favorite thing about it is that it reacts with water and turns back into silica, and it can do this in both your lungs and your eyes. The best part too is that the particles form in the eyes under the surface, and they're way too small to remove, so it can lead to permanent blindness. For this reason, when I was going to be working with it, I'd have to be very careful and to only use it under a fume hood. This small bottle of it cost me about $100, and I ordered it from a chemical company. Now, the other things that I needed were methanol and concentrated ammonia. For the methanol, I just bought it from a local hardware store, and I got the ammonia online. With all the ingredients, I was now ready to get started, and the first thing that I had to do was make some dilute ammonia. The stuff that I had here was concentrated, so it was around 28 to 30%, but I needed it to be closer to around 0.1 or 0.2. To do this, I just added 5.4 mils of the concentrated stuff to a bottle and poured in a liter of distilled water. After this, I moved on to making the actual gel solution, and I added 33 mils of methanol to 2 beakers, and then into the one on the left, I also added 16.5 mils of that dilute ammonia that I just made. With this all added, I then busted out the TMOS, and I carefully poured in 33 mils to the one on the right. This gave me my 2 starting solutions, and to make the gel, all I had to do was mix them. So I turned on some strong stirring, dumped one into the other, and let it stir for about 30 seconds. It didn't look like much was happening, but there was a reaction going on, so I had to pour it into I could. So I had to somehow come up with a way to do this, and this was the part that made making the gels a lot harder than I initially thought. This is mostly because the final gels are really delicate to the point that I feel like they could break almost just by looking at them. This totally ruled out using any of those soft silicone molds, and it also would just get stuck in any hard mold. So, I wasn't able to use any traditional mold for this, and I had to get a bit creative. I spent about a week trying out random things, and eventually, I came up with something that worked. It was also really cheap and easy, and what I ended up using was a plastic cookie cutter that I got from Amazon. I think it might have been okay on its own, but to make sure that the gel didn't stick to it, I sprayed it with a bunch of silicone lubricant and wiped it down. After that, I put it onto a piece of glass that I took out of my IKEA display cabinet, and I made a border around it with duct tape. With the tape in place, I took away the cookie cutter, and I used a dollar store cheese grater to shred one whole dollar store candle. I then melted all the wax by blasting it with my heat gun, which is basically an overpowered hairdryer. When it all seemed nice and liquidy, I used a ruler to scrape off the extra stuff, and the goal was to make a layer about the thickness of the tape. This part was always a little bit sloppy, and I usually had to scrape it and remelt it at least a couple times. It didn't have to be perfect though, and all I wanted was for the glass to be covered in a somewhat even layer of wax. When I felt that I had this, I dropped the cookie cutter onto it and I put a dish on top to help keep it in place. I then shot it again with the heat gun to really make sure that the edges were sealed, and I let it sit there for 30 minutes for all the wax to harden. At this point, it still might not make sense how this was all going to work, but I promise that it will make sense in a few minutes. Also, just to be clear, this was all done well before even starting to make the gel solution, because like I said before, that starts to harden in less than 10 minutes. But now, cutting back to the gel solution that I made, it had only been a couple minutes, and I started filling the mold. I found that the best amount to add was 10.4 mils, and I did this as fast as I could, and then covered the whole thing with a dish. As the reaction continued, it would cause things to slowly heat up, and without a cover, the gels would all dry out and crack. With the dish though, the methanol vapor was kept inside, and this problem seemed to be avoided. What I had to do now was basically just wait for it all to turn into a gel. This usually took around 10 or 15 minutes, but just by looking at it, it was very hard to tell when it was ready. So, I came up with a very scientific method to figure this out, where I would occasionally just punch the table and see how it shook. I also found that it was just good to punch the table in general, because even early on, it helped release some bubbles. Eventually, around the 10-minute mark, when I would hit the table, it looked pretty solid. When I saw this, I would usually give it a few more minutes, and then I would take off the dish and add some more methanol. This had to be done quickly though, because a lot of the methanol had vaporized, and there wasn't much of it left on the surface. Right now, they were all still way too fragile, and if I tried moving them, they would probably crack and fall apart. So I let them sit there for another 10 minutes, which gave more time for the TMOS to react and for the gels to get stronger. After that, they all looked good to go, so I took away the dish, and now it was time to see why I put this whole weird setup together. I first added some more methanol, and then I carefully pulled on the corner of the mold, and I cracked it away from the wax. I then peeled off the rest of it, and I was able to completely separate it without putting any real strain on the gels. The gels were all still technically in the mold, but there was now no bottom, and I could easily get them out without damaging them. All I had to do was push on them a bit, and they slid out really easily. They were all dropped directly into a bunch of fresh methanol, and I went back to making some more gels. However, this time, I didn't just use the same mold again, and I instead used the main goal was to replace all the water with methanol, but this process was unfortunately very slow. It would take about a week to be done, where every day or second day, I would lift it out and put it into some new methanol. This part of the process was definitely the most wasteful, and just to make these gels, I had to use about 10 liters of methanol. There wasn't much way around this though, because I had to make sure that there was absolutely no water left. I also do plan to recycle all of it by distilling it, but still, it was a lot of solvent to make such a small amount of gel. After letting them soak for about a day, I took out one of them to have a closer look at it. When I started this project, I was really hoping to make gels that were completely smooth, but the surface of this one was a bit rough looking. This happened because when I was making it, I added the extra methanol a bit too early, and the surface hadn't completely hardened. This was a bit disappointing, but it also didn't matter too much, and it shouldn't be noticeable in the final aerogel. After this, I took a look at the hexagon one, and I thought that it looked pretty good. However, I apparently squeezed a bit too hard on it, and it broke and fell back into the methanol. The whole gel making part was pretty much done, and all I had to do was swap out the methanol a few more times. After this, the next major step was to dry the gels and replace all the methanol with air, but just like everything in this project, it wasn't super straightforward. I wanted to see what would happen if I just tried evaporating the methanol, and I also blew on things occurring with the methanol and the very small pores in the gel. As the methanol evaporates at the surface, the methanol deeper in the gel tries to move up its pores and fill its place. This creates an inward pulling force on the walls of the pores, causes a lot of them to contract or even collapse. This also happens at different rates all over the gel, which puts uneven forces on it and causes it to crack and shrink. It was very hard, and it felt like porous and crunchy glass. What I thought was cool though, was that it still had that slight blue haze that you see with aerogel. Then just for fun, I added some water to it, and it started popping like crazy. After this, I let it dry, and what I was left with looked a lot like glass. However, it wasn't completely solid, and it was still very porous. But anyway, that was kind of a tangent, and the main point is that you can't just dry the gel in a normal way. It has to be done using a specialized method so that it doesn't collapse on itself. There are a couple ways to do this, but I decided to go with the most common way, which is by supercritical drying using CO2. The general idea behind this process was to first replace all the methanol in the gel with liquid CO2. The liquid CO2 is then heated until it goes supercritical, where it's kind of a mixture between a liquid and a gas. Then from there, it can be converted to just plain CO2 gas. By doing this, we're basically turning a liquid into a gas without having to evaporate it. This makes it possible to completely avoid that problem with capillary action, and the gel shouldn't collapse. The methanol here was just being used as an intermediate because the liquid CO2 isn't able to mix with water. It is technically possible, though, to make methanol go supercritical, but it's a lot more dangerous. But with all that being said, to actually do this, I had to put together a specialized supercritical dryer. And like the gel recipe, I also got the information on how to do this from aerogel.org. They have a full guide and a complete parts list, and they also have a lot of very useful information when it comes to making aerogel in general. I decided to deviate a bit from their guide though, and to build a slightly bigger chamber. The main chamber of their larger version had an inner diameter of 1.5 inches, but I decided to bump it up to 2. Almost all these pieces were pretty specialized, and I couldn't just buy them in any local hardware store. The entire thing also had to be made out of high-pressure stainless steel, which wasn't exactly cheap. And unfortunately, there wasn't much of a way around this because building it with cheaper materials, especially those not rated for high pressures, is a major safety problem. Unsuitable materials have failed and exploded and hurt people in the past, and it's not something to take lightly. But anyway, with that being said, I was able to order all these pieces online from a supplier called McMaster Car. It all arrived a few days later, and the first thing that I did was take everything out of pressures is a major safety problem. Unsuitable material, take everything out of its packaging and roughly lay it all out.
Counter-terrorists win. Right, lads. We're on. victory.